If you're not familiar with the ways of science, then you don't know why your presidents do what they do. And if you're not familiar with history, then you're not even familiar with why you do what you do. Okay, well, it's 9:11 p.m. Central Daylight Time in America, and I've just been looking at some videos of on YouTube of our previous presidents that show the history of our relationship with Iraq and Iran, and how we got to the point where we became at war with them. It mostly goes back to World War II, when Europe didn't have any natural gas or oil supplies for gasoline to supply their military to fight World War II. And we were already finding those oil reserves in Saudi Arabia, or places that would become Saudi Arabia in the future. But we found oil supplies in Iran for Europe to fuel their military, and which later become British Petroleum in Iraq. And that fueled the British military for a good while, until some time in the early to mid-1950s. The British were famous in their empire conquest with being rude or belittling the countries that they occupied. They were famous for doing this in Africa and over in French Asia, which will become Bali at some point, and eventually Kenya and Africa. And so as they became perceived as being rude in Iran, they were pretty much asked to leave in the same manner they were asked to leave Africa in the mid-80s during apartheid. And we couldn't allow the collapse of these democratic countries that we supported after World War II, like Norway and Denmark and Holland, and even the German and Slovak republics we took over, or didn't take over but helped fund later on, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and places like that. If we gave up the oil fields in Iran to the Iranians in the mid-80s, then Europe would have been bankrupt and their military powerless. So we took over the Iranian political presidency all the way up to the Ayatollah Khomeini, which is when in the early 80s, actually the mid-70s, universities started opening in Iran and started teaching their college students, where they can actually learn their own Muslim history and recognize that their own president was very westernized. He had a short haircut, wore a western suit, shaved face. Well, so how did we get to this state between us and the Middle East being at such close odds of war, where we've left Iraq and now we're almost about to have a war with Iran if Israel doesn't on its own, or the entire UN does it on its own. It has a whole lot to do with religion and religious views that were born from a state of empathy, where they're all tied together by their religion, and we're tied together by a nation. And it's because there's probably about 3 decades difference in an empathetic evolution that arose from being empathetic to your tribe or your family, your local community. That you could see it with the Indians. We're all at war with each other when us, the European invaders, got here. They weren't organized. They were fighting with each other because they were local groups at odds with each other. As Europeans, we'd gone through the entire Renaissance, and a time period after that for feudal states up until nations were born and allegiance were born, all the way up through the French Revolution. That these revolutionary ties never happened in the Middle East. Then it has a lot to do with education. That the further your education goes, the more your empathy or empathic state grows. And you can watch it happen across America today. That the closer you get to the center of the United States, the more racist and homophobic people become. Where when you get closer to Miami or New York or Los Angeles, the less the racism occurs, and the less of the homophobia, the less of the judgment, and that's why movies and things like pornography and commercials and things like that are all created in New York, Miami, Los Angeles, and not where the people are most separated from the rest of the world live out in the United States. And so that's where you find, you get to the middle of the United States and a little bit south, you still find people driving around in pickups with Confederate flags in the back of them. Because the more they're separated from these people they don't understand, the more they fear them. So the more their hate grows for them. So it's no wonder you go someplace like Afghanistan and there's a hatred for America, because they're so far removed from our lifestyle or our understandings or even our knowledge, and they've had less access to education. So the farther away you get from access to education in places such like San Diego, Los Angeles, Miami, or New York, you get closer to the middle of the United States, you're farther removed from education, so your intelligence dwindles and your fear of the people you don't understand increases, and it's all really directly related. So we got to where we're at by virtue of education, which was mandated through U.S. government law. If you're familiar with programs like Little House on the Prairie, you would understand that there was a point when our government knew that they couldn't call troops together as a mandated force, that like the Civil War military compared to today's military, that most of Americans were illiterate, racist, and very stuck on local religious views. Well, we were becoming like the entire Middle East, sects of religions that would become Baptist, Methodist, Mennonites, any religion you can think of in America, with understanding that if most Americans, somewhere around 80% of them, were illiterate, they wouldn't even be able to understand a call to arms if a war happened. I think this happened somewhere around Woodrow Wilson's administration, that we needed to make the general public literate enough to at least understand when there was a call to arms, you needed to show up and participate in defending your own country. And this caused a lot of controversy. It even happens still today. It's the reason we have homeschooling and Christian churches and schools that would rather teach evolution as opposed to creationism. This battle is still being waged in America today, and it goes back to even places like Cambodia, where some of the worst atrocities that ever happened on the planet were in the name of killing education. And those places don't call it education, they call it westernization. And so that's why we have helicopters and battleships and airports and metropolises and commercialization. And it's why we have Victoria's Secret, and why they live in the jungle or in a third world impoverished country. It always comes back to education. But the smarter you are, the more you understand what's going on in the rest of the planet and with other people, and the less fear you have of it. And because basically with knowledge comes power, and hopefully with power there's always a great empathy, so that we understand why these people are doing what they're doing and why they direct their anger towards us when we didn't mean to intentionally harm anybody else. But here we are, stuck with the world's largest military by far, which inherits us to become the world police, whether we like it or not. That's what we are. And so now what we do with it pretty much comes up to us. That we were all joined together in this empathetic state again through 9/11 with nationalism. So we go back to what was familiar, being patriotic. And it took us a step back, but maybe it grew us a little bit farther, or a little bit stronger at least. If we're going to be the world police, then that's what we need to do. We need to step up and take charge, or back out and see who else is going to do it. Are we going to leave it up to China? I hope not. I hope we put that power in our own hands and do what we think we need to do as American citizens. Okay, I'm sorry, I've just gone through probably 120 years of American history in about, hopefully, a little bit over 15 minutes. And I'm going to try to come back and review this in more detail so that you can understand that all these events were related our history is related, and that everything you're observing today actually came from something that your grandmother or grandfather did, and their grandparents did, and their grandparents did. And see the relationship between education and understanding, and the relationship between knowledge and power, and that how the Romans gained power and lost empathy. And so maybe as Americans, as we gain power, we can keep this empathy somehow. That after all, if we didn't have that empathy, we wouldn't want to teach our children, and they would become dumber, and we'd go back to some place we really don't want to come from. So hopefully in the future I'm going to get to explain this in a little more detail and with a little more accuracy. But for now, thanks for watching the program. See you later.